Good afternoon and welcome to today's Social Media Roundtable. My name's James Marley and I'll be your host for this afternoon. As you saw in the introduction, a brief infographic of the results from the 2013 BRR Media ASX 200 Social Media Survey. Some of the key stats were that LinkedIn is by far and away the clear leader in terms of adoption within the ASX 200, and over 3/4 of companies have taken up social media in one way, shape, form or the other. What we don't have this afternoon is enough time to cover all of these topics in great detail, but what I do have is a panel of experts that are going to help touch on some of the key points that were raised in the ASX 200 Social Media Roundtable. That was a bit of a mouthful. And Bartlett Bragg joins me from the Ripple Effect Group, and thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Delighted to be here.
Rebecca Wilson from Buchan Consulting. Beck, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, James.
And Andrew Rich from Herbert Smith Freehills, who's joined us from the legal fraternity. Thanks very much for pulling up.
Thank you very much, James.
I think one of the things that stood out for me from the report is that there's still a great division between companies believing whether there's an opportunity or a risk that exists within social media. We see great uptake, particularly with the consumer facing brands. Obviously there's a clear channel for them to speak with their potential consumers, but the people that are not participating are still struggling to understand some of the risks around compliance, and particularly for the listed vehicles that trade on a day-to-day basis, the risk of sensitive information being leaked is there. And I think also for companies that are resource scarce, they need to build a business case for it. And I think a lot of CEOs, maybe from an older generation, still a little bit sceptical or yet to be presented with a clear business case for using social media. And I might open with you and just get you to, Ripple Effect Group has worked for some time in the social media space. In this particular sector, ASX 200, what do you think some of the unrealised opportunities of the social media channels could be? And maybe talk me through a couple of examples of some companies that are using it.
Yes, I think there's some enormous unrealised potential, and Australia, although it's encouraging in the report, and I think it's really exciting to finally see Australia catching up, we're still way behind the rest of the world. The Fortune 500 are way ahead of us in adoption and their strategies and maturity in how they approach these things. So you look at examples where we've seen the CEO of ANZ join LinkedIn as one of their influencers. So that's the first Australian on the influencer list, and you sort of go, why is that? Why are we not there? And I think it is not understanding the business case and the potential, where it moves beyond just marketing and advertising. Social technologies are very mature globally, and unrealised potential could include not using it in the context internally within the organisation for communications, collaboration, reaching out to partners. In that B2B sector, it is so underdeveloped, fairly much globally, but certainly in Australia, people are not using that for their supply chain, communication with their investors, all sorts of opportunities there beyond marketing. And examples sort of abound. Internally, McKinsey have just released some really interesting stats that are showing 90% of organisations that use communication channels through all the social technologies are showing at least a 65% benefit in productivity. Mm-hmm. You know, those figures are absolutely compelling. So the question is not when should we do it, should we do it? It's like how and when will we do it? And a strategic approach to productivity and efficiency gains to look at how you might improve your business processes, include internal and external, and engagement with your suppliers is just something you can't ignore anymore.
Andrew, the listed company space is the one that we've looked at in this report. Sensitivity does arise around the fact that these are exchange-traded vehicles. There's information that could be considered materially sensitive to their share prices, and that's obviously been one of the things that the ASX has asked them to look at. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons why companies that are not actively pursuing social media are holding back, because they're uncertain of A, obligations, and B, what the real risks are, and for that reason not participating to a certain extent has been the approach. What are some of the questions or the concerns that your listed clients talk to you about, and how do you advise them on the back of that?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of examples in the press, a lot of well-documented cases where information has got out there via the social media before the more normal channels. The more normal channels being, in the eyes of the ASX, if you've got material information, it's got to go out via the ASX first. And what we're seeing, have seen a few examples of, is information that's gone out there first via social media avenues. And what clients are asking us is, well, what does this all mean for us in terms of monitoring social media? Can we just dismiss it? Clearly not. Can we, if we're going to embrace it, how do we make sure we're not tripping ourselves up on the ASX rules? And what the ASX has said is, look, nothing has changed. If you've got something that's material and really important to your share price, it's got to go out in the ASX first. That rule has not changed. It has, however, said that there are periods where any company, for example, if it's in the middle of takeover discussions, doesn't want that information released to the market because that could jeopardise the transaction. What the ASX is saying is, you've actually, in those sort of heightened sensitive periods of sensitivity, you need to be actively monitoring social media outlets just to see if the information's already leaked out there, because it can leak out there just like that. And if you see it leak, you've got to make an announcement. You've lost confidentiality, and your transaction has to be disclosed publicly perhaps before you're ready.
I think one of the interesting things is, since the ASX Guidance Note 8 has come out, is that we are now seeing a real shift for public companies. So I think at a minimum they're saying, okay, we understand we need to monitor. And then I think we're getting them engaged in that process and now saying, well, let's do more than just monitor. What can we do in terms of broadening your distribution channel? So using it as a distribution channel, and then hopefully we can steer them towards actually using it a little bit more proactively to engage. And I think that's going to take some process because of some of those regulatory issues that we've had. And it's really interesting. Yesterday we had what I think is the first case of Guidance Note 8 really coming into effect. A company called Neuren Pharmaceuticals is developing a phase 2 drug, and they had to go into trading halt yesterday because someone on that trial started talking very positively about the effects of the drug that it had on them. Now, this is a blinded study, and so clearly very material, and so went into trading halt. And it's the first example where we're starting to see Guidance Note 8 really sort of take effect to public companies. I think a really good example of how that should be working with public companies and monitoring social media.
Yeah, very much so. And I personally expect to see a lot more trading halts being called. In the past, a trading halt has been associated with bad news or the company's got something to hide. But now with Guidance Note 8 making it quite clear that it's actually a very useful device to ensure an orderly release of information, I think we'll see more of these examples where something perhaps goes out on to use an example of a leak, something gets out on social media before the company's quite ready. I think we'll see trading halts become far more frequent.
I think there's another perspective to look at on that, and it's a sort of counter one where there's quite sophisticated investor and trader groups setting up really sophisticated data mining processes through social media. So they're actually managing some of that and searching that differently. Now, if the organisation isn't aware of those and actually participating in those, that'll influence the share price before the company's even sort of hit it. And likewise, you've got examples where, it was a couple of years ago now, the Qantas aircraft over Indonesia lost part of its engine cowling, and it happened to be the red part with a bit of a kangaroo on it. So they're going aircraft down. It was all over social media. It was hours before there was an official announcement saying it's not down. You know, so those sorts of things, share prices can hit that. So you need to have a very sophisticated monitoring to be aware of people talking about you, but also those traders and investors that have these very sophisticated data mining processes can easily influence things.
So if we just take a step away from the, I guess, the trading aspect of the role that social media can play for some of these listed companies, and you touched on this earlier, the ability for people to present themselves as thought leaders. Now there's the CEO of a business is an intelligent person, they're an expert in their field, and clearly they want to position their brand and themselves as leaders in their field. Beck, I think you were saying offline you'd set up Don Argus with his own Twitter account or something along those lines. Could I maybe take the discussion towards the opportunity for people to use it as a brand building, I guess, a vehicle or a communication channel for brand building and for pushing forward thought leadership and those sorts of things?
So I think certainly, what we're seeing is there are a group of people who are wanting to get onto things like Twitter to experience it, to understand it. And so I think that's a really great thing. But taking it to that next step, like you're saying, I do think there's a great opportunity for it. For public companies, clearly they need to do that within the normal, boundaries of materiality. But, when they're presenting or they're speaking to the press, being able to really leverage that by using sort of social media channels, I think is the way that they're going, and people are certainly using that very effectively.
And there's opportunity to engage beyond just the broadcast of the thought leadership, which clearly there are. If you go onto LinkedIn and look at the influencer list, there's some great reads on those. But the opportunity then to engage and have that debate back with the audience, your customers, your partners, suppliers, is just underutilised again. And the ability for a CEO to kind of go out there and say, okay, so what do you guys think? It is just enormous. But that's a quantum leap in what we're used to doing. And I think it's the braver or more out there personalities that can cope with it initially. But it's certainly something that provides enormous potential, again, unrealised.
I think I was saying before offline, I'm really keen to use it. I see the value in it. But it's still another thing in a busy schedule. How do you think, I guess, marketers or social media managers within a business can go about building a business case for leaders within their organisation to embrace social media?
I think the first thing is it has to fit within your broader communication plan. So, none of this has to happen or should happen in isolation. And I think that's what we're finding is you've got to take a step back and go, what is it we're trying to achieve from a communication strategy perspective, and where does social media fit within that? So I think one of the questions we get, or one of the statements we get from our clients is, oh, we should be on Facebook, or we should be on that, or we should be on this. And I'm like, fine, great, good to hear it, but why? Why do you want to go on those things? And really understanding what are the drivers and what are the objectives, and then picking the right medium for them to actually use. And I think that's really important when you think about what should I be doing from a social media perspective.
And from a measurement perspective, what are some of the things people can measure?
You can measure, you've got to really, again, go back to your objectives, look at your strategic approach. There's a lot of measurements that are really meaningless without engagement. So Facebook likes, I've got thousands of them, so what, who cares? Yeah. Are you actually engaged? Are they producing sales, a return? What are you trying to do with that? So again, with the strategic approach, you're working out your objectives. Is it more engagement? Is it more sales? What is that you're trying to achieve, and then you set your objectives. So I'm sort of suggesting instead of return on investment, we should be looking at return on engagement. I mean, when was the last time someone did a business case for ROI on email? Now, seriously. I mean, come on. Email is the pain of our life. I get far too many. I spend far too much time in my inbox. If you could put a case forward to get rid of those, which we can with social technologies, then that's return on engagement. It's not about the investment. So I think we need to shift. We're using traditional business measurements to measure something that is totally different to how we've operated before. So let's challenge that and reframe our thinking. Let's get real and let's look at it differently.
Okay. Well, from this side of the room, we're talking, I think, from an optimistic perspective. Andrew, what are some of the like from a corporate perspective, the conversations that you have with your clients? Like, what are some of the alarm bells that ring when you walk in and the discussion is around social media? What do you think some of the real resistance points are?
Well, a lot of the conversations are around what sort of policies should we adopt internally. I mean, you walk around our office, many of the screens have just got Facebook on.
In a law firm?
Even in a law firm.
Facebook, is it still allowed?
Good to hear it's not banned, huh?
Hasn't been banned.
Hasn't been banned, okay.
But it gives rise to some interesting questions for corporates, because people know that they can't go and talk to journalists about confidential information. But for some reason, putting something into a social media platform is kind of different, or people might think it's kind of different, but in reality, nothing has changed. So corporates are saying to us, well, how do we get that message across to our staff that information is just as confidential today as it was yesterday? And how do we make it clear to people that this quiet little gossipy conversation you think you might be having through Facebook actually can cause the company to get into some quite hot water? And at the end of the day, it's a pretty easy piece of advice you can give to your clients, which is nothing has changed. Confidential information remains confidential. You shouldn't be talking about work matters through some of these social media channels unless you're authorised to do so. And this is where where it then shifts to when you are authorised to do so, it then strays into the marketing or the business case sphere, which is it's got to be done properly. And if it's done properly, it can have a terrific impact on the business.
And are you finding with your interactions with corporates that first conversation is happening and you're navigating that successfully and moving through into the next levels?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the clients are interested in firstly having a policy so that people know what can and can't be done or said through social media. And again, it's pretty simple stuff. If something's not on the public record, you shouldn't be talking about it if you're just you're not one of the mouthpieces of the organisation, because it's got to be done both in compliance with the law through the ASX listing rules, but more importantly, from a business perspective, you don't want to be delivering a message which is inconsistent with the corporate message, or to, by doing so, you don't get the best bang for your buck out of your messaging.
I think there's an alternative, about that, because let's say you've got a really enthusiastic workforce, love your product, they're committed to it, they want to talk about it. So let's enable them to do that within the parameters. Let's not just have a policy, let's have a conversation and let's educate. And trust is cheaper than control. So let's get a trustworthy, loyal, enthusiastic employment workforce and get them talking about the product, bring in all their friends as well, but with an education piece around it. We've seen so many examples where the policy for social media is tucked into a big HR document that clearly no one reads because it's this big, and they don't actually understand what it means to not talk about your colleagues online. Well, what does that mean? And there's been some rather graphic examples of that not so long ago. An Optus employee, one of their social media gurus, actually said some pretty derogatory things that he thought was private. They weren't. We all read it, had a bit of a giggle, and got himself into a bit of trouble. So there's conversations, but trust is cheaper than control. And we really need to, again, shift our mindset.
The reality of that, though, is really difficult with public companies in
Shouldn't
terms of
be.
being... Well, no, I think it is, because in terms of, you made the point, we don't let everyone talk to the press. And I think if you don't have boundaries in place in terms of... what I find, there's a blending of personal and professional, whereas my advice is always there can't be a blurring between personal and professional, because that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah.
So I think in an ideal world, of course, we want to be able to liberate our employees and they can be our biggest advocates, but in busy organisations, being able to monitor that, being able to ensure the education piece stays up, it's just another level.
But do you
of work.
trust your employees to go to the pub and talk to their friends? Do you trust your employees with very expensive equipment, from iPads, telephones, etc.? We trust them to communicate on email to people, we trust them to communicate in all sorts of ways, yet we don't trust them on the internet. Now, yes, there is a thing called disinhibition, which is a psychological kind of, it's not me talking directly, but we can work with that very simply. They're adults. You've employed them because they've got something to add value. So we need to shift our thinking again and allow those things to come through in a very educated way. We need to be adults about this. It's not that frightening. And once you make people realise, they go, oh yeah, I get it, done.
It's a really good example, which I think plays into your point quite nicely, where there was a Facebook site that came up for Coke in the US. Amazingly, Coke did not have its own Facebook page at the time, and it was put up by some supporters, some people who enjoy drinking Coke. And the interesting thing is the first thing, in the past, it would have been, let's try and pull it down because we don't have control over it. Yet Coke took the position that, hang on a sec, these are our biggest advocates. These are the guys that are supporting us. Right. Let's give them the freedom to have their own site and let's support them. So I think, going to your point, it's an example. I just find that, maybe that's where we need to move towards. And, I'd like to think that I certainly trust my staff, but I think there has to be some boundaries in some areas.
I appreciate the boundaries. So it's just being sensible about it without doing that lockdown thing.
In terms of where to from here, I mean, the report showed that the actual growth in social media between 2012 and 2013 was not astronomical. There was, a single-digit growth across the major platforms in most of the cases, which, lends you to think either there's a pausing and a bit of a taking a deep breath of it. People are still out to see as to the value of it. Or perhaps, for that sample size, maybe it's reached maturity and it's just certain companies where it's not going to suit their business. I'm going to open this across the board. Just on this demographic, the ASX 200 or say Australia's leading businesses, where to from here with social media? Is it at maturity? Is it going to go further? Is it going to take up more of the communication space?
I think we're at the absolute beginning of the curve for public companies. So, 2 years ago, I struggled to even have the conversation around the table, whereas now there is an acceptance that it's pervasive, they need to participate, and there is a fantastic opportunity for them to participate. I think for us too, it's also been about convincing them that there is an opportunity from B to I, so business to investors. Because one of the questions I'd always get is, but no, there's no investors on Twitter and there's no investors in social media. Well, there is, and the research actually showed that is one of the areas that's growing, and certainly the research out of the US shows the same thing. So I think we're at the very bottom of the curve, and over the coming years, we're going to see a real step up from public companies using a lot more social media, tweeting out results, being able to really sort of use it as a much more engaging platform.
We're very much behind the rest of the world. The results are there. It was encouraging. I thought it was really positive, and it did indicate that we were starting to be more mature in our approach, but we are still lagging a couple of years behind Europe and the US, and that's quite interesting when we are the largest in our APAC region. We're the largest social media users in the world. So across our region, we spend more time on social networks in our personal lives than any other area, which always sort of shocks the US, who think they sort of invent these things. So if you look at that adoption, why is it when we get to work we have this big disconnect? So I think the businesses need to start tapping in on that, and perhaps it is a great opportunity for everyone to really take this more mature approach and look at how to do it properly.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The other thing we're seeing too is that the social media platforms are actually, in a sense, starting to take over a little bit from the annual general meeting from the company in terms of in years gone by, it was the annual general meeting where the directors were actually hearing for the first time what many of their smaller shareholders were actually thinking about the performance or direction of the company. Now, they just log on to one or two of these sites that some of the investors have set up, and they're getting a pretty good feel for what some of the smaller shareholders are thinking about the way they're going.
Yeah, great point to tap into that audience and get the feedback before a meeting or something. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I know as an interviewer in the listed company space, one of the things I do as a ritual before I research a company or interview a company is I go through all the different blogs, regardless of their credibility, and go and read what people are saying about the company, and I often raise that in the pre-briefing with the company, and they will often say, where did you read that? So,
yeah. That's a really good point, because some of the research I was looking at recently when the report came out indicated that investors and the general public see things like that. They're savvy enough, because we use it a lot, to kind of go, well, I need to verify that information, validate it before I make my opinion. They go to the corporate space, owned spaces, and they're not getting the answers. So they're kind of, this is another opportunity to get that corrected information out there. So that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. Andrew, before we wrap things up, if companies come as a starting point, I have no doubt compliance and that aspect of things is going to be one of the major points they need to get checked off. What are the starting points for you when companies come to you with those sorts of questions?
Well, we always ask them, what are you doing at the moment? If you're withholding information from the public, as you're allowed to do in certain circumstances, what are you actually doing to check that the information hasn't leaked out there somewhere? And again, in years gone by, you'd say, well, I've just been monitoring my share price. It's usually a pretty good indication, and I've been reading the newspapers. But there's a growing acceptance out there that that's just not enough anymore, and that what you really do need to be doing is monitoring a lot of these social media platforms to just see if what you think is confidential information has actually leaked out there already. So in answer to your question, it really is there's an increased acceptance of the need to monitor this stuff, and we're seeing the investor relations teams of a lot of these ASX listed companies growing in size, because the amount of information that's out there now about the company, both good, bad, indifferent, is growing exponentially on a daily, weekly, monthly basis.
Alrighty, well that was quite an interesting and lively discussion, and certainly not enough time to cover all of the topics and the questions that I'm sure many of our viewers would have about this area. I'd like to thank all of my panellists for coming in today and for shedding a bit of light on the report. Andrew, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Beck, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And Anne, great for you to pop in, and thanks for coming upstairs.
Thank you.
For all the people that are viewing, if you'd like to download a copy of the report, it's available at the BRR Media Services website, services.brrmedia.com. If you have any questions, please send it through to brr@brrmedia.com. My name's James Marley. Appreciate you taking the time to watch, and look forward to your company on future shows.